And welcome to our first episode of Amateur Game of the Week. This week we're going to be looking at a game from the David Mote Memorial tournament in America, which happened about a little over a month ago, between William Naff and Cole Mayhew. Cole's a regular poster on the 2+2 chess forum. It's actually a poker forum, but the chess thread on the poker forum, and he set up a thread about his how he went in this tournament that he played in. He actually ended up coming equal first with 4 out of 4, which is a fantastic effort, particularly as it was, I believe, his first over-the-board tournament. He's played some online, but hadn't actually played much over-the-board tournament. And I believe this was his first or second tournament, and to come equal first is really a fantastic result. What I'll be using, not only my own sort of analysis and computer analysis and stuff like that, I'll also be looking at Cole's comments that he put up on his chess blog, Smart Guy Dumb Chess. Fantastic title for a blog. But I'll be using some of that as we go through the analysis of the game itself. Anyway, it starts off, Cole's black in this position. It starts off as fairly standard Ruy Lopez and the exchange variation. Cole comments here that he doesn't see this very often and that he'll try and keep developing and holding on to the critical pawn on e5, which is obviously something to worry about in the opening, in particular in this position. White castles, but obviously taking the pawn immediately doesn't work because black has queen d4, and then after the knight retreats, picks up the e-pawn and gets a perfectly fine game. So white castles, and here of the many options, Kyle chose Bishop d6, which is one of the less popular moves in this position. More common, either f6, the idea again to hold this e-pawn. Cole mentioned that he was concerned about development, but at present, yes, white has castled and got a knight out, and black's pieces are all still on the back rank. But there's really no obvious way to exploit this at the moment. The usual follow-up for white is to try and take the centre, playing d4, pawn takes, knight takes, c5, knight b3, queen takes, rook takes d1, bishop g4, f6, and bishop e6. Something like this is a normal kind of line from this position. And having traded off, obviously having traded off queens, you've already traded off a set of minor pieces. You're heading into an ending where white's going to try and use the advantages in terms of a pawn structure, and black's going to eventually try and exploit the advantage of having the two bishops. So it's fairly evenly balanced. At the moment, white's probably slightly better, again because of that development, the fact that he's got at least temporarily control of the d-file with the rook, some obvious squares for pieces, things like bishop e3 to attack this c5 pawn. So white has probably the easier game, although it's not like black's exactly dead in this position either. Black has a perfectly fine game as well. It's going to be very different to the type of thing you see in the game. The other normal alternative after castles is to play bishop g4 and pin the knight on f3. Again, another way similar to what we'll see in the game to defend the e-pawn. And normally in this position, the standard line follows up h3 and h5. One of these ideas that you can't really take the bishop on g4 because after pawn takes, you've got the rook coming down the h-file. If the knight ever moves, the queen comes out to h4, and it's almost like you have an instant mating attack. So in this situation, white normally just plays around it, plays d3, queen f6, again trying to get something back in terms of pawn structure. Knight d2, knight e7, given that the knight's on d2, blocking the bishop's control of the f4 square. So now the knight from e7 can come to g6 and possibly heading into f4 as a way to launch an attack. So rook e1, knight g6, and this is our normal kind of position from this line, where black obviously has played it fairly aggressively and has plenty of chances, but it's not like white's completely dead in this position either. You've got chances for both sides. So bishop d6 is what Kyle played here. And here, the normal move, again, here is to play d4. Again, trying to exploit some of the position that white has. So normally you'll end up with a line like e takes d4, queen takes d4, again exploiting this pawn on g7 now that the bishop's not there, and f6, and the whole game is basically going to revolve around this e5 square. Alternatively, after d4, black can try bishop g4, and then you often end up with again a lot of pieces swapped off. So a line like d takes e5, bishop takes f3, queen takes, bishop takes e5, knight d2. And again, we've got some pieces traded off. Again, this e5 square is going to be very important to the whole outcome of the game. But in this case, white's chosen b3. So obviously the bishop is going to go to b2, or ordinarily you'd think it was going to go to b2, to build up pressure on this e5 pawn. Here Kyle played knight f6, and as I've put here in my notes, I've actually had the same position has occurred in a game in Poland, which was drawn in 20 moves, a fairly sort of quiet manoeuvring game. However, this position was actually black to move. It came about because of an exchange, a delayed exchange, where after a6, white had played bishop a4, and then after knight f6, white took on c6. And then we ended up with this position with black to move instead of being with white to move. Here Kyle says b3 is interesting. You're assuming that he's going to make a target out of the e5 pawn. If this is the case, it seems more logical, rather than playing knight f6, to actually put the pawn on f6 and help strong point this e5 square. If you look at a similar kind of position, admittedly this has come from a bit of a different opening, like a Trompovsky, for example, something along these lines. If you're black to play in this position, obviously you want the bishop to go to g7 at some stage, but to help support the oncoming attack on d5, you're probably more likely to want to play a move like c6 and help block this diagonal that white's got this bishop on. So if you go back to the game, yes, it's a bit different in terms of the fact that, okay, it's the king that you're playing f6 on rather than the queen. But if the bishop's going to b2, you really want to blunt this diagonal. So f6, often a theme in this opening, is perfectly fine in this position. And it'd be a move that I'd probably prefer to play, but again, stylistically, one way or the other, it's much, some people like some type of moves and some people like others. But knight f6, maybe not the most thematic kind of move in this position. A bit later on, the kind of awkwardness of this knight actually leads to the combination that Kyle actually plays, but he actually says that he doesn't like the knight on f6 in this position later on. And again, more logical in my mind, particularly given that the bishop's most likely going to b2 and this f4 square isn't going to be covered by the bishop. Instead of that is knight e7 and knight g6, and again aiming for this f4 square and using that as a launching point for an attack. An alternative to knight f6 might be to play bishop g4. Again, same kind of idea that we'll see a bit later in the game. And you might end up with a line like, let's say h3, bishop h5, d3, queen d7, bishop e3, although maybe not bishop e3. This is one of the few games I found in my database with this line. Castles, knight d2, and again this finished up as a win for a win for black in 40 moves, but not really so much because of the opening, more so because black just decided to attack and got in first. The alternative after bishop g4, at least that I found in my database anyway, was bishop b2, which makes perfect sense. Knight f6, rook e1, castles. In both of the two games I had in the database on this position, both times black chose to castle kingside. d3 and then knight d7, again looking to overprotect the e5 pawn, and they both ended up on around move 30, one win for each side, basically based on who got their attack in first. However, Kyle played knight f6, not a bad move in itself, but again, as I was saying before, maybe a little bit awkwardly placed for the knight on f6. d3 makes perfect sense. Bishop g4. Here Kyle says he tried to protect the pawn indirectly with a pin, and he was also hoping that it tied up his queen, the white queen, for a bit. h3 makes some sense. Bishop h5, and here Kyle says he can't decide if this is a chess strength or a weakness, but basically when white played h3, he kind of got really excited and sort of thought, oh gee, this is a great idea. Now that I've got a weakness to attack, this is going to justify a kingside attack, which to some extent is true. This idea that you have the pawn on h3 often sets up something that we'll see again later in the game, this idea of pushing the g-pawn, and this idea of a hook on g4 in this case, playing g5 and g4. The point being that, yes, you're threatening the knight, but if the knight just moves away, then you can take the pawn on h3. Whereas if that pawn was back on h2, the knight could just move and there wouldn't be any need for further weakening of the position around the king. So here white this calmly plays bishop b2, which seems perfectly fine, again attacking the e-pawn. Queen e7. Again, here as Kyle says, it protects the pawn, develops the queen, and gives me yet another chance or another excuse to do what I wanted to do anyway in terms of castling queenside and launching this kingside attack. Knight d2 is a logical move that you'll see offered in these positions for white. And here Kyle castles queenside. And he says, why not invite an opposite side's attack? My double pawns on the queen side are now king defenders, where their doubledness, as he puts it, won't hurt a bit. His fianchetto bishop on b2 isn't going to help much in the queenside attack for him, while I like the position of my pieces to launch a kingside attack. And as Cole points out, there's definitely some validity to what he said. Here, white plays a move that probably isn't really necessary just yet. He plays a4. The idea is, after playing knight c4, not really going to have to worry about pushing the pawn up to b5 to threaten the knight. But given that the king's now over here, b5 really isn't going to be a threat. So in this position, I'd probably do something about the pin, or about developing the rook and maybe setting up more of a thematic move that you'll see in the Spanish, something like the rook going to e1, followed by knight f1 and knight g3, which is a standard kind of idea in the Spanish. This idea of knight f1, knight g3 again helps attack the bishop on h5, but not something that white chose to do. So a4, not in itself a bad move,